He didn't speak when she entered, didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't even breathe the way he had moments earlier. From the second judge, Amara Hill stepped onto the bench, black robe flowing just past her knees, spine straight, gaze level. The air in the room didn't just change, it folded. Like something sacred had just walked in, or something remembered. Officer Raymond Kessler sat in the second row, flanked by his lawyer on the left, and a sinking sense of disbelief on the right. His jaw was set tight, but his grip on the armrest said otherwise. He knew her name before it was announced. He'd known the moment she walked through the door. She didn't look at him. Not yet. She scanned the courtroom like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. And maybe she had. But it was the sound of her heels against the polished floor that haunted him most. Clean, deliberate, unapologetic. Kessler had seen a lot of judges in his time. Angry ones, bored ones, drunk ones, but never one whose very presence stripped the room of its certainty. Never one whose silence was louder than his badge ever had been. And in that stillness, when she took her seat behind the bench and calmly adjusted the nameplate in front of her, something happened that hadn't happened to him in over a decade. He felt exposed, because no one else in the courtroom knew what he had done to her 4 years earlier. No one else remembered the girl in holding with wrists cuffed too tight, hair full and proud, voice steady until it wasn't. But he did. He remembered every second. The cold metal clippers in his hand, the silence when the buzz started, the way she looked at the floor, not him as chunks of her identity fell onto concrete. Back then, it was policy, he told himself, procedure, just doing his job. But now she was sitting higher than him, and she hadn't said a single word. Not yet. But Kessler knew. It was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't sound like revenge. It would sound like justice. 4 years earlier, the holding cell was colder than it needed to be. There was a bench, a single flickering light above it, and a drain in the middle of the floor that looked like it hadn't been scrubbed since Reagan was in office. Amara sat cuffed to a metal ring bolted into the wall, wearing an orange jumpsuit that didn't fit, and shoes that weren't hers. Her hair was still full then, braided back tightly, clean, precise, beautiful. It was the first thing they noticed. Always was. They'd picked her up outside a city building. She'd been marching with a group, chanting slogans about eviction reform, holding up a clipboard and a copy of a rental code. There were no weapons, no threats, no shattered glass. Just a black woman speaking clearly and loudly enough that someone in a uniform got nervous. The report said she was non-compliant. She wasn't, she was just firm, and some men never learned to tell the difference. She expected the waiting. The cuffs. Even the fingerprints. What she didn't expect, what she couldn't have expected, was Officer Kessler stepping into the cell with clippers in his hand and a half smirk behind his badge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't yell. He just held the cord in one hand, looked her dead in the eye and said, "Gotta shave it. Policy." Amara blinked. "There's nothing in the rules about—" "Could be something in there," he interrupted, nodding at her braids. "Drugs, needles. Or maybe you hide a shiv in that crown of yours." The word hit harder than the clippers ever could. Crown, like it was something to take, something to humiliate. She looked to the female officer standing in the corner, young, nervous, lips twitching like they wanted to speak but couldn't. And they didn't. No one said a word as the first buzz echoed in that concrete room. She felt the teeth of the clippers scrape across her scalp, felt the weight fall, braid by braid, felt her spine lock into place, not from fear but defiance. She never cried. But when it was done, she wouldn't look in the mirror. Kessler stood over her, unplugged the clippers, and gave her one last look. "You'll thank me," he said, voice low. "This kind of attention doesn't look good in law school applications." He didn't know she'd already been accepted. He didn't care. Because in that moment, Amara was just another black body in a jumpsuit, and the sound of her dignity being stripped away was just part of the job. There was no footage, no paperwork, no internal memo, no one filed a complaint, and even if she had, the response would have been the same. Who's gonna believe a defendant over a decorated officer? The day after they shaved her head, they moved her to a different facility. Quietly. No press, no protest, just a new intake number, a different bunk, and a reminder that her name didn't matter here. When the public defender finally arrived, 3 days later, with a half-empty folder and an overworked stare, he didn't mention the haircut. Didn't ask. Just said, "We'll push for time served. Take the deal, keep your head down, and don't make noise." She wanted to scream, not just for herself, but for the part of her that had been clipped and discarded like trash. But her voice had already been measured, judged, and silenced. She signed the form anyway. And when she left that building 2 weeks later, wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in and a hoodie pulled tight over her freshly shorn scalp, no one looked at her twice. No news story, no outrage, not even a whisper. Because black women didn't get outrage. They got warnings. They got, "You should be grateful it wasn't worse." Her classmates didn't ask what happened. Some looked uncomfortable when they saw her. Others nodded politely and changed the subject. The only person who met her eyes for longer than a second was Professor Darnell, a former civil rights attorney turned torts lecturer. He saw her across the lecture hall that first day back, paused mid-sentence and said, "You okay?" It wasn't just the words. It was how he said them, like he already knew. Amara gave the smallest nod, and he never brought it up again. But from that day forward, he treated her like someone preparing for war. And maybe she was, because what everyone else saw as her silence was really her loading the file, indexing every humiliation, every shrug, every name that didn't defend her, every door that closed too quietly. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the system to say her name, out loud and with respect. And someday, she was going to make sure it did. Law school didn't break her. It sharpened her. While others chased clerkships and summer associateships like status symbols, Amara collected case law the way a hunter collects tracks. Every syllabus, every lecture, every precedent. She studied them not just for the grade, but for what they failed to say out loud. Because that's where the system kept its real secrets, not in what it punished, but in what it permitted. In the margins of her textbooks, she didn't doodle hearts or highlight in neon. She scribbled notes like, "How many times before a pattern becomes policy? What if the system is working as designed?" As the buzz of the clippers never really left her, it hummed beneath her every exam. It whispered under every gavel she heard drop during mock trials. Her professors called her brilliant, peers called her intense. But no one knew she wasn't building a career. She was building a case, against them, against the silence, against the idea that dignity could be trimmed for procedure, and no one would notice. And while others drank to celebrate midterms or grumbled about internships, Amara spent her evenings going through public records, disciplinary actions, civilian complaints, use of force reports, until one day, it hit her like a gut punch. There he was, Raymond Kessler. Same department, same precinct, still on the force, still decorated, still untouched. She stared at the screen for a long time, fists clenched so tight her nails left crescents in her palm. The rage came, sharp, clean, burning. And then, like it always had with her, it turned to strategy. She didn't print the file, didn't screenshot it, didn't breathe a word. She simply closed her laptop and said out loud, to no one in particular, "See you in court." It had been years since she'd last walked through those doors, and yet when Amara Hill stepped into the Cook County Courthouse that morning, The marble floors seemed to remember her footsteps, like even the building knew this wasn't just another judge reporting for duty. There were no cameras, no fanfare, no headlines screaming her name. But the security guard at the front desk paused mid-sentence. The clerk near the elevators straightened in her chair, and one officer, older, badge tilted slightly, coffee halfway to his lips, froze, blinked twice, and watched her walk by like he'd just seen a ghost who remembered everything. She didn't walk with arrogance. She didn't walk with revenge. She walked like she'd earned every inch of ground beneath her. There was something different in her stride, not the kind that comes from titles or robes or courtroom authority, but the kind that comes from surviving something meant to erase you, and choosing, deliberately, to be more visible because of it. She greeted the court administrator with a calm nod, signed the docket clipboard with a black ink pen she carried herself, and declined the assistant's offer to help carry her files. Her chambers were waiting, plain and empty like a blank canvas, one she planned to paint with precedent and memory. But even then, even in that quiet hallway, there was tension, not fear, not awe, recognition. People didn't know her story, not all of it, but they knew something had happened, that there was weight in the way she moved and a quiet fire behind her stillness that said, "Don't test me, not today." And Raymond Kessler, he didn't work in that building anymore, but his name was still spoken in the parking garage. His badge still earned nods in certain rooms, and his laugh, that smug little chuckle, still echoed in too many stories that ended without consequences. He hadn't seen her yet. But he would, and when he did, he wouldn't recognize her at first. Not because her face had changed, but because it hadn't. It had grown into everything he tried to cut away. And this time, when she sat behind the bench and adjusted the mic, her voice wouldn't shake. Because this time, the courtroom belonged to her. He didn't recognize the name when he first saw it on the docket. Didn't flinch when the prosecutor whispered, "We've got a new judge. Hill, I think. Amara Hill." Didn't even blink when the bailiff mentioned she was young, but no nonsense. But when the courtroom door opened and she stepped through, black robe draped like armor, chin lifted just enough to command attention without demanding it, something inside Raymond Kessler twisted, not in the gut, deeper, something ancient, something ugly. For a second, he thought maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was someone with the same name. Maybe it was just one of those eerie tricks life plays when you think you've buried something deep enough to forget. But then she looked up, just for a second, and didn't look away. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her mouth didn't move. But her stillness, it wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It was louder than any gavel he'd ever heard. And that's when he knew. She remembered. Everything he had hoped was buried under department bureaucracy, sealed in some forgotten intake form, erased by time and convenience. She had carried it, not as a wound, but as a weapon. He shifted in his seat, suddenly too aware of the stiffness in his collar, the dryness in his mouth, the way the bench creaked beneath him. He'd spent 20 years in rooms like this, barking orders, testifying with certainty, acting like justice was something handed down from men like him. Now he couldn't even meet her eyes. He tried to remind himself of what he used to tell the rookies. Confidence is 90% of the badge. But what do you do when your badge walks in wearing a robe and doesn't need to speak to be heard? The hearing hadn't even started, and he already felt cross-examined, not by her, by the space between them, by the silence that used to protect him, now turned against him like a spotlight he couldn't switch off. He clenched his jaw, tried to breathe evenly, tried to forget. But when she finally spoke, calm, clear, no tremor in her voice, something shattered. It wasn't just memory. It was the illusion that he had ever been untouchable. When Judge Amara Hill finally addressed the room, it wasn't with the clipped legalese that most judges use to signal efficiency over empathy. No, her voice, though controlled, carried a cadence that felt older than the bench she sat on. It didn't rise, it didn't rush. But somehow, it made every man in that courtroom sit straighter, as if they instinctively understood that this wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning wrapped in protocol. She began with the basics. The case file in front of her opened cleanly, her fingers poised on the edges of the paper like a pianist deciding whether to play a funeral dirge or a battle hymn. She spoke of the motion at hand, the procedural context, the citations, everything by the book, impeccable. But woven between her sentences, barely perceptible unless you were listening closely, or unless you knew, there were pauses, small, strategic pauses, moments where silence didn't just fill space, it rewrote it. And across the aisle, Raymond Kessler heard everyone. Because to him, those pauses weren't silence at all. They were the hum of clippers, the buzz of fluorescent lights in a concrete cell, the heavy breathing of someone who had authority but no decency. He tried not to look at her, but every time she turned a page or adjusted her glasses, the past flickered through the fabric of the present like a glitch in the system. Except this glitch had a bar license and the gavel now. And when she finally asked him to approach the bench, not with hostility, not with accusation, but with the calm indifference of someone who no longer had anything to prove, he stood like a man climbing his own gallows. She didn't call him officer, didn't acknowledge his rank. She used his full name, flat, neutral, unapologetic, Mr. Raymond Kessler. And in that moment, stripped of his badge, his uniform, his swagger, he was just a man answering to the consequences he thought he'd never meet. She asked him a procedural question, one he should have answered easily, but his voice cracked. Not from nerves, not from confusion, but because he knew she knew, and worse. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of naming it. Because what she understood now, better than anyone else in that room, was that some justice isn't about screaming the truth at the top of your lungs. Sometimes it's about saying nothing and letting the guilty fill in the blanks themselves. So she thanked him, dismissed him, and turned back to her paperwork like the matter had never required more than that. But behind her calm, behind her precise posture and flawless delivery, sat a woman who had walked into the very room she'd once been broken in. Only now, she was the one deciding who got heard and who got silenced. And the silence, this time, it was hers. The hallway outside the courtroom wasn't particularly long, but to Raymond Kessler, it stretched like a corridor in a nightmare. Each step forward swallowed by a silence that no badge, no decades of service, no worn leather holster could protect him from. He moved quickly, as if walking fast could shake the weight off his shoulders. But there was no shaking it. Because this wasn't about pace. It was about presence, and hers was still everywhere. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pointed a finger, hadn't accused him of anything beyond procedure. And yet, somehow he felt like the whole damn building had watched him fall apart. Not dramatically, not visibly, but quietly, in that terrifying way a man unravels when he realizes that someone else now holds the narrative, and that narrative has receipts. He reached the end of the hall and paused by the water fountain, not because he was thirsty, but because he needed a reason to stop, to pretend he still had some control over his body, his breathing, his expression. A young officer passed him and nodded. Kessler nodded back, but it didn't land right. It felt rehearsed. Hollow. He could hear his own thoughts now, not just as ideas, but as echoes, reverberations of choices made and dismissed, reports written and buried, moments where power had been used not as a shield but as a weapon, and now that power was bleeding him dry. He tried to push the image of her face away, the calmness, the stillness, the way she didn't even need to say what he'd done because the air between them said it louder, and that was the part he couldn't shake. She hadn't given him the satisfaction of a fight. She'd given him the cold mercy of indifference. And it was worse. because it meant she had already judged him long before he entered that courtroom. And she didn't need to convict him out loud. She knew. He knew she knew, and worse, she knew he knew she knew. The triple indictment of guilt, recognition, and irrelevance. By the time he reached the parking lot, the sun had shifted. He squinted, stared at his car, then looked back at the courthouse for a long moment, wondering, not for the first time, if justice was ever really blind, or if it just waited patiently until it could stare you down from the bench. He got into his car, closed the door, sat there, engine off, silence deafening. And for the first time in decades, Raymond Kessler didn't feel like an officer or a veteran or a protector. He felt like a footnote in someone else's case file. In the weeks that followed, Judge Amara Hill didn't mention Kessler's name again. Not in chambers, not in court, not even to her closest confidants. She didn't need to. What she set in motion didn't require headlines or grand gestures. It required discipline. And she had that in abundance. Each case she presided over became more than a ruling. It became a reconstruction. She began to notice the patterns most people were too tired or too complicit to name. The names on the intake forms, the language used in officer reports, the way certain cases seemed to disappear into procedural shadows while others, lighter, cleaner, whiter, rose to the surface like foam. She didn't rage. She documented. She didn't accuse. She archived. In closed-door meetings with district liaisons, she asked measured questions. In case reviews with public defenders, she listened more than she spoke. And at night, when the courthouse lights dimmed, she stayed, reading, cross-referencing, pulling threads others had stopped pulling out of exhaustion or fear. What began as a return to her profession slowly became an audit of its soul. She found herself revisiting the names of women she'd seen years ago. Girls who'd sat in holding cells without representation. Mothers charged with resisting arrest for shielding their sons. Transcripts of hearings where the loudest voice in the room had worn a badge instead of a robe. And she wasn't alone. The bailiff, an older woman named Rivera, started leaving case notes on her desk after hours. Not formal, not official, just sticky notes with phrases like, "Check the stop and search pattern here," or "Same officer, 4 complaints." The janitor, Mr. Cole, began nodding more slowly when he passed her office, like he understood in his own way that something was shifting in this building. And one afternoon, a young law clerk hesitated at her door. "Judge Hill," she said softly, "you're not just processing cases, are you?" Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to, because what she was building wasn't a rebellion. It was a record. One that couldn't be undone by retirement, silence, or erasure. And somewhere, deep down, Raymond Kessler probably felt it, though he'd never admit it, that what had started with a single courtroom stare was now echoing into a system he once navigated with impunity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the record, and Amara Hill was just getting started. The first article appeared in the back corner of a local paper, buried under council updates and a piece about pothole repairs. "New judge brings quiet reform to 6th Circuit," it read. No photo. Just 3 short paragraphs and a quote from a defense attorney who asked to remain anonymous. Amara didn't read it. She didn't need to. But by the time the 4th article appeared, this time in a national legal newsletter with the headline, "The Hill Effect," her clerk printed it out and left it on her desk without saying a word. She sighed, because she knew what was coming. The media loved patterns, especially when they could package them as people. They didn't care about the years she spent studying systemic inequality, or the lonely hours combing through transcripts, or the late-night calls she took from panicked defenders with no resources. They wanted an image, a face, a tagline. "Black woman judge tackles corrupt policing, one gavel at a time. Justice with a side of vengeance." They wanted sound bites, but Amara Hill wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in ledgers. Still, she couldn't stop the wave. Local reporters started lingering outside the courthouse after hearings. One morning, a documentary crew tried to film her as she walked in, her robe still folded over one arm, coffee in hand, exhaustion in her eyes. She didn't speak to them, didn't wave, didn't smile. And yet, that footage aired on 3 different news channels the following week. She walks alone, but never unnoticed. She hated it, because to her this wasn't a story. It was a responsibility, not a spotlight, but a spreadsheet. Her chambers became quieter, her staff more cautious. She started receiving letters, not all of them supportive. Some were grateful, some were furious. One just said, "I remember what you looked like with no hair." She didn't flinch, didn't even show her clerk. Just folded the letter once, slid it into her bottom drawer, and kept writing. Because what they didn't understand, what they would probably never understand, was that Amara wasn't trying to become the face of change. She was trying to make it so that no one else had to become a symbol, just to be heard. And if that meant letting the media spin its wheel while she filed her orders and kept her pace, so be it. The system had failed quietly for long enough. Maybe it was time justice learned how to whisper louder than outrage. They didn't call her aggressive. They called her too meticulous. They didn't accuse her of bias. They said she seemed emotionally invested. The resistance never came with flashing red lights. It came in the form of delayed memos, rescheduled briefings, and whispered doubts passed over coffee in break rooms she no longer entered. Amara Hill could feel it, the slow tightening of a noose that no one dared to call a rope. A prosecutor she'd worked with for years suddenly forgot to include key evidence in a pre-trial packet. A clerk, who used to greet her with warmth, now addressed her only with titles and avoided her eyes. An internal audit request was filed against her, citing procedural irregularities, a phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. She wasn't surprised. She was prepared. What rattled her wasn't the pushback, it was the elegance of it. The way the system defended itself like an old organism, sending out antibodies to attack what it mistook for infection, not realizing that infection had worn a badge, carried a gavel, and signed off on broken lives for decades. She reviewed the audit documents in silence, red pen in hand, circling the vague accusations with calm precision. Unilateral decision-making, she wrote in the margin. Judicial discretion. See statute. Overcorrection in bias cases. Correcting injustice is not bias, but even as she fought with logic, she could feel the emotional undertow. It was subtle, but insistent, the kind of pressure that made even good people start to wonder if change was worth the cost of their comfort. She met with her clerk after hours. "You know they're trying to scare you," the young woman said, voice trembling not from fear, but fury. Amara nodded. "They won't get away with it." "They already have," she replied softly. "They've been getting away with it for years. I'm just inconvenient." But that word, inconvenient, carried more weight than most accusations ever could, because when justice becomes a disruption instead of a foundation, the real rot is already inside the walls. She left the office late again that night. As she walked through the empty halls, past the framed photographs of judges who came before her, all white, all male, all solemn, she stopped at the end. There was an empty frame on the wall, reserved for the next photo. She looked at it for a moment, her own reflection ghosting in the glass. Then she turned away, because she wasn't here to be framed. She was here to break the glass. Raymond Kessler walked into the courtroom, not to testify, not to appeal, but to see if what people were saying was true. He sat in the back row, unseen, but seeing everything. Judge Hill entered, calm, precise, powerful, no theatrics, no fury, just control. She called the case, read the names, laid out the facts. One of them was Officer Daniels, Kessler's old partner. And when she spoke, she didn't flinch. She didn't soften her words. She didn't glance at Kessler. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about everyone he had silenced. The courtroom was still. Daniels looked like a man realizing the world had turned without him. And Kessler. He finally understood. He wasn't in the room to witness a fall. He was there to witness a rise. Amara Hill didn't just survive what they did to her. She rewrote the power structure that let them do it. And the bench? It fit her like it had always been hers. If this story hit you where it should, don't scroll past. Subscribe for more stories that speak the truth, loud enough to shake walls. Because the system isn't broken. It's being rebuilt by women like her.